Hey guys, this is Chess Coach Andrew Rankin. Welcome back to the series Just Winning with White. Today I wanted to demonstrate a really nice system against the Benoni. So the Benoni starts with d4, e6, c4, c5. And here you really need to push the d pawn and grab some space. The Benoni is an interesting weapon, but I feel like White gets a very comfortable game if you follow this system. So oftentimes they'll take. If they don't take, you end up with a light square pawn structure, and then you try and trade off your light square bishop and just play with the space advantage. But the open Benoni, I think, is much better for black, and therefore you'll face this system more often. And even if you've already played the move e4, for example, they can delay taking and take much later, but you always want to take with the c pawn, because the c4 square is always an option to reroute a knight to. My opponent continues with d6. I play knight to c3, supporting the center, also preventing the move pawn to b5, which is a very common expanding idea for black. He plays a6, so he's really trying to play the move b5, and as soon as you see the move a6 or anything that prepares the move, such as here, here, or here, preparing the move b5, you need to meet that with a4. You really cannot allow black to expand on the queen side. So then black continues with knight f6. We play e4, supporting our center. He plays g6. Now we play bishop to d3. And now it's very important that before we develop the knight, we play the move a3. And the idea is to stop this bishop from getting to any good squares. And preventing the bishop from going to any good squares means that the bishop and the knight are going to be fighting for the d7 square. So black castles. Now we play knight to f3. He brings his knight out. Rook to e8 is also an idea, but either way we're just going to castle, and now white is nice and solid. So remember this idea with knight c3, e4, bishop d3, a3, knight f3. So I always tell myself bishop d3, e4, a3, knight f3. That's something that I repeated to myself over and over and over again until I learned this system. Bishop d3, sorry, e4, bishop d3, a3, knight f3. So it goes pawn, bishop, pawn, knight. Pawn, bishop, pawn, knight. Hopefully that wasn't excessive, but hopefully you guys remember the system because it's very important and it's very good for white. So my opponent puts the rook on the e-file, and now the bishop needs to come to f4. And the point of this is that the a pawn blocks the light square bishop from coming to any good squares on the king side, but it also simultaneously creates a little pocket for the bishop that's going to come to f4, and we're going to put pressure on the d pawn. So like I said, when the c4 square is vacant, sometimes an idea is knight to d2 and then knight to c4, and we just basically pile up as much pressure on the backwards d6 pawn as possible. He plays queen to c7, and you notice black has really no plans. We continue by putting our rook behind the center pawn, and we're going to try and play pawn to e5 if we can. And now when the knight comes to h5, possibly preparing the move f5, we drop the bishop back to h2, nice and solid. And now my opponent puts the knight on e5, and this is an important moment. A lot of times, and I used to play the move knight takes, bishop takes, and then rook takes, and then I'd prepare the move f4. But recently I've learned that a much better strategy is to drop the bishop back to e2, and now we have the simple threat of knight takes and then bishop takes here. And so my opponent should play the move knight back to f6, and then we can take here, and he has to take with the pawn, and now we have a passed d pawn. But he doesn't do that. I guess he could take here and then move his knight back, but he doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. I guess he can trade one pair of knights, which is good for the party with less space. But Once the bishop gets to f3, which is really our goal here, then we're going to be able to start pushing these pawns, and the bishop becomes a monster on this diagonal. And we sometimes can use tactics to push this pawn. For example, even though the queen guards it, we use the move d6, attacking the queen, and then we take back on e5. But unfortunately that didn't happen in the game. My opponent simply developed his light square bishop and blundered knight takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and then he takes here with check, but we take back, and you notice his king is super weak. We're up a pawn, and yeah, we traded off the light square bishop, but we have basically a light square pawn complex. a4, d5, e4, g2, h3. So I'm not too worried about him having the light square bishop. He puts the rook on e5. I played queen to h6. He goes queen to d8, which blunders this pawn, but I wanted to kick the rook out and prevent his pieces from getting active. So he drops the rook back to e8, and now I take the pawn. He brings the queen in, and I thought for a long time here, I didn't know whether I should take the bishop or stay defending this pawn. So I decided that being up 2 pawns and him having a weak king and me having this really nice pass pawn on d5 and me having arguably more active pieces meant that I didn't need to rush in and grab material and simply just look for solid play. So I played pawn to f5, and my idea is just queen to g3, trading off the queens. Now he finally realizes his bishop is hanging, so he defends it, and now I have time to trade the queens. I bring the king in, and now I just prepare to create basically unstoppable pass pawns in the center. We trade off the pawns. He brings the rook to the g file. I drop back. Now I fight for the g file, very useful. Even if he drops over to the h file and gives me checks on h4, I can always bring my rook up to block. If he goes here, I think maybe I could even give the check and then bring the other rook around. That way I can always block on g2 and use this rook to block on g4. So he drops the bishop back, and now I think it's time to make some progress. So we push e5, driving the king back. King goes here. We push e6, and now he makes kind of a fatal mistake, even though I think the position is probably +6 for white anyway. He comes back, and now the knight comes in with check. And we give a check, and he resigns here. And if he played rook takes, which is really the only move, because you notice if he drops his king back here, then he loses the rook. And if he drops his king back here, then he gets forked with e7. So either way, he's going to lose a rook. So he should have played rook takes here, but then we win this rook. We're attacking this guy. He's still hanging, so something like rook takes, and then I guess the rook comes over here, but yeah, we can just bring the second rook, and yeah, this should be easy cleanup for white. So hopefully the system is useful for you. I know that I've had a couple people ask for what to do against the Benoni. So yeah, when they push, you push on d5. When they take, you always take with the c pawn, and then your knight goes to c3. Your pawn goes to e4, the bishop goes to d3. h3, stopping this bishop from pinning your knight. Castles, then knight f3, then castles, and then the bishop goes to f4. And this setup is really fun for white. It's super easy to play. We're going to play against black's queenside advance. Even if he gets the rook here, and let's say the queen meanders over here or something. Well, not here, because say the rook comes here, and the bishop was here actually, and he managed to trade off the knight. And he does actually get enough attackers for b5. We can actually play the move pawn to a5, and we can bring the queen to d2, which has the double threat of trading off the strong dark square bishop and supporting the a5 pawn, allowing our knight to reroute from a4 to b6. And once it's on b6, it can get to c4, which puts more pressure on d6, and it also puts a lot of pressure on black's key squares, because these are really key squares that black uses to develop, especially d7. So yeah, a5, Queen d2, knight a4, knight b6, knight c4 is an idea. There's also rook e1, knight d2, knight c4. The problem with knight d2, knight c4 is that when you go knight d2, the knight will jump into e5. And then when you go to c4, he simply trades off. And I don't feel like white gains a whole lot from that. So the reroute from knight to d2 to c4 requires a little bit of patience because you can't allow a knight to drop into e5. And then always the idea is to get the e5 pawn break. White is always trying to shove the e5 pawn forward. And if the queen is on c7, after the pawn takes, if the queen is the key defender of the e5 square that allows it to work, then you push the pawn to d6. Ideally, it's defended by a queen or a rook, kicking the queen away, and then you take back on e5. So that's the idea there. And I'm going to link a game by John Bartholomew, who also plays this system and recommends it. And it's very interesting, and he explains it well. So I'll link that in the description, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Take care. Bye.